Hey guys, this is Bacchanalian, a commentator for Alliance Tournament 12. So the match we're going to look at here is going to be AT11 Day 3 match 82. I believe this was the third match of the winner, third match of the winners bracket here. And Verge of Collapse came into this as defending champions. They had won AT10. And Rote Kapelle are kind of perennial middle-of-the-road performers. They make it somewhere in the middle of the tournament, and that's about it. But they do have a history of giant slaying. They have knocked, or beat PL, I should say, in the early stages before. They knocked out AAA a couple of years back. So they're always a bit of a threat here. And really coming into this, as I recall, it was the most gambled on Eve Bet or something, was the most gambled on match of the day by a large margin. And kind of the most anticipated match of the day. And really a lot of people, the odds were very much in favor of Verge of Collapse. And well, we'll see how it turns out here. But it was really a very interesting match, both from the implication perspective and the tactics you'll see. We are going to see some very interesting tactics right away. Rote Kapelle came in with a fairly high DPS, but very close range setup. You can already see, Navy Brutix's, they had the Oneros, Vexers, some damp power with Celestis, Maulus, and a couple of Assault Frigate Enyos, maybe a screen. Verge of Collapse came in with Fleet Foon's Vindicator, and again, some damps on their side as well as some frigate tackle and logistics. So it was very interesting to see these are two relatively close-range setups. And Verge of Collapse actually, they got 1 point from the beginning because Rote Kapelle came in 1 point under without even realizing it.
And I think it's interesting to mention you don't see something like a Fleet Typhoon paired with a Vindicator all that often. The Fleet Typhoon, obviously typically cruise fit. You see it as a high projection, high DPS platform, but the pairing with the Vindicator is really interesting to me. The Vindicator obviously has to get in close. It's got that hard tackle potential. It's going to help the damage application of the entire team, but you have to wonder, I mean, just looking at this from the start, are these Fleet Typhoons going to go in and try and apply the utility they might have in the high slots in the way of Smart Bombs, Newts, or are they going to sit in the back and hope that their screen is effective from that healthy frigate tackle wing and the Vindicator?
Definitely, and the other thing to mention here from the warp in is the Verge of Collapse team warps in at, I think, 50. I mean, they warped in at a pretty long range. Rote Kapelle warped most of their stuff in right at 0. But then, right here at the beginning of the match, as it kicks off, you see the Rote Kapelle team actually turning around and flying in the opposite direction. And Verge of Collapse is doing the exact same thing.
And you can see the Vindicator sitting at 0 MS. He's tracking disrupted just in case, but that could be one of two things. It could be either A, somebody's asleep at the wheel, or B, they're just thinking, and there's no pressure to move that Vindy. And I would assume the latter just based on how they're moving, but they're definitely giving those Typhoons a little bit of space, not much in the back. And I'm kind of looking forward to the Vindy's moving now, and you would kind of expect him to try and get in close and amplify the application from the Fleet Typhoons, but everyone's playing really safely now. I mean, both teams recognize that the real threat is in the close range fight. They both eventually hope to take the close range fight, but the question is who takes it from a better angle. Those Brutixes are going to be all together, whereas the Vindicator is probably going to be solo with the Fleet Typhoons hanging back, so this Vindy pilot has a lot of weight on his shoulders, deciding when to go in and making sure that when he does, everybody's prepared to follow him in.
Yeah, and it is, I mean, a good thing to point out, like you said, he's tracking disrupted. That will play in a little bit later when everyone gets in close. Even hitting battlecruiser hulls if you're kind of orbiting, keeping some transversal up, and depending on how many tracking disruptors Rote Kapelle are actually using here, that could really actually mess with his tracking a bit. There was initially, Damp War had been won by Verge of Collapse. At the very beginning of the match, you see an awful lot of damps come down across the Rote Kapelle team. But by here, we're looking at over about a minute and a half, minute 40 in, it starts to switch a little bit. And Rote starts getting some damps freed up and getting damps on the Verge of Collapse team. And we're actually, it's kind of even for a little while. So it looks like it's a lot of posturing, like you say, and a lot of E-War going on. Really no damage coming across early on. These teams are actually just look like they are set, the Rote Kapelle team set on follow on the Captain Bob Shaftos, and they're just kind of circling the arena waiting to see what happens.
And I think you see this more often in the higher level teams than you do in the lower level. That patience and that willingness to sit and just think. They recognize that 10 minutes, especially in high DPS close range setups like this, the 10-minute limitation is probably not going to be what wins you the match, especially on the side of Verge of Collapse. I mean, the likelihood of them keeping one battleship alive is pretty low, so they need to hedge their bets, make sure that they get their engagement right the first time around. I will say, You have to consider with Rote Kapelle. I mean, they're moving now, and they are. You can see the Brutix Navy issues 700, 600. Like you said, they're sort of approaching. Nothing too aggressive. They're trying to stay in a good position relative to each other and relative to the enemy, but they have more mobility in their DPS. The Vindicator and the Fleet Foons. Fleet Typhoon's not slow by any means, but these are armor that is going to slow them down a little bit. Those Brutix Navy issues with an overheated MWD, even though they are armor, are going to be able to close that gap very quickly. So if you're looking for that burst of aggression, there's higher potential for Rote Kapelle than there is for Verge of Collapse. And that's something you should look toward. Now you're just seeing the first damage coming across the Punisher, but the reps are applying fairly early on.
Right, so what we're seeing here is a hero Punisher from Verge of Collapse trying to cross the field, maybe get a tackle. I think you actually web scram the Oneros here, and they're going to start trying to apply damage to him. And the reps on the Verge of Collapse side are actually doing a pretty good job keeping him up, but he's also webbed and scrammed. So this is kind of the first blood in the match, and I think this is something that Bob Shafto as a Captain Rote Kapelle was waiting for. Like, as you say, he's a higher mobility setup, so let them make the mistake, let them come to us, and we can take advantage of the fact that they may get spread out in the process.
So, I mean, tactically, if you're sitting on the Verge of Collapse side, is it a mistake to send that Punisher in and try and force something, or is it a necessary gamble?
I think it really is a necessary gamble. I mean, like, Rote Kapelle has the upper hand in terms of positioning here. You can't really run down Brutix Navy issues with the Vindicator. It's just not going to happen unless the Brutix Navy issues let it happen. And so you maybe send in one of your frigates, your Tech 1 frigate, let it give a shot to see if it can. It's the tankiest of them. Let it see if it can pin something down and separate the Oneros. Look for a mistake. Can maybe it'll disjoint the Rote Kapelle team enough that the Oneros gets caught out on its own and they can close in and kill it while the Brutix Navies figure out what to do. That didn't work, and so you'll see that this is when the teams start coming together. The Rote Kapelle team takes this opportunity to just dive in. You got everybody charging in and tackle immediately on one of the Fleet Foons, and he's absolutely melting. He's just getting plowed through. There's a Vexer on the Rote Kapelle team, meanwhile, that looks like he's going to get traded. And really, from the Verge of Collapse side, that's not a very good trade.
And it is important to note that one of the Fleet Typhoons was scram-webbed for a very long time before any tackle was applied on the Rote Kapelle side. That Vindicator is a serious linchpin in the setup. You see this first Fleet Typhoon dying. But the Vindicator, yes, he's tracking disrupted, but you also have to think about his tackle potential. He's all about screening. Those Brutix Navy issues, we talked about the mobility, but there's not much mobility under 90% web, of which he has at least 2. So how did a Fleet Typhoon put itself in a position to get scram-webbed without having the Vindicator there to try and assist and scrape that tackle off? I think positioning-wise, that was a huge mistake on the side of Verge of Collapse.
And you can see the Vindicator is kind of out in what looked like was in front of those Foons, but the Rote Kapelle team had kind of circled around the arena a little bit and came at it from an angle, and the Vindicator pilot never seemed to really respond to that. So they almost got in around behind him to get to those things first. And by the time they got in, you only saw the web on that one Vexer that just, goes down for Rote Kapelle around the same time as the second Fleet Foon for Verge of Collapse. So by the time Verge of Collapse get their Vindicator webs applied to something, and they applied only to one thing, they lose, they kill that one thing, but they've lost 2 of their 3 DPS boats, and the Vindicator is next on the list. And by this time, they don't, Rote Kapelle doesn't care if they're webbed by the Vindicator. They've got 3 Brutix Navy issues in there doing damage to it, and they're really not taking much damage themselves.
So Rote Kapelle smartly took advantage of the mobility, like you're saying. I mean, even a good Vindy pilot is going to really struggle to immobilize 3 more mobile targets. I mean, the 3 Brutix Navy issues, even if 2 of them piloted poorly and did get webbed, that third is still going to move through. And while that third is not going to slink a Fleet Typhoon, I mean, that with a high DPS frigate wing is still enough pressure. I think it does speak to the confidence of Rote Kapelle and the potency of a high DPS, especially blaster rush setup, that they didn't even touch the Guardian. I mean, there was just now you see a damp on the Guardian. The E-War was completely unimportant in terms of those Fleet Typhoons dying. They recognized very early that they had enough DPS to break through, regardless of the Logi, and really smartly just ignored it, worried more about positioning than getting in and killing those reps, and obviously paid off in spades.
This is something for anyone who might have watched SCL last year. Syndicate Competitive League has kind of died off for the time being. But Bob Shafto was featured in that tournament as a captain for I forget which team. But this was a tactic we saw from him quite a bit as well. He would do this. He'd see a setup that he didn't know exactly how to approach it, so he wouldn't approach it. He'd turn around and motor away and let them make the first move to see what was happening. And then it paid off very well for him in SCL, and it's paid off well for him in this match extremely well.
So to your point earlier, I mean about the Brutix Navy issues not minding being tackled, you sort of see a stall, if you will, in the fighting. I mean those Brutix Navy issues, they are armor, and the huge benefit to that, yes, you sacrifice a little bit of DPS as compared to the shield rush setups we've seen, but you gain control. You've got webs, so you can see the frigate wing right now paying the price of fighting armor Brutix Navy issues. Um, it's a pretty, in my mind anyways, at this stage in the match, it's pretty well done. It would be great for Rote Kapelle to sink that Guardian just to solidify it and really sink the frigate wing, but it's pretty well over. If you're in Verge of Collapse and you're still on grid in the Guardian, the Prophecy, whatever it might be, what do? I mean, what are you saying on comms right now?
Gosh, I mean, what can you do? I think at this point you kind of know it's over, and maybe you hope to save the Vindicator just with a tiny little bit of ISK you're going to save from it, and Verge of Collapse knowing they're probably moving down to the losers bracket after this, and they need every little ounce of, whatever they've got left. I mean, Rote Kapelle decides that when trying to go for the Vindicator, they can't break it, so that's when they do. They switch damage to the Guardian, and it goes down fairly quickly. We've about a minute and a half left. I think they switch back to the Vindicator, and you'll see how fast these Brutix Navy issues actually plow through it. It's pretty crazy. I can remember discussing in the commentary that we didn't think the Vindicator was going to go down on time, and it does.
I mean, on top of the added mobility, one of the things I talk about every single time I'm discussing the Alliance tournament is the difference in mentality between a team that piles a lot of points on a few ships versus teams that like to distribute their points more evenly. And I think this particular Alliance tournament, more than a lot of the others, shows sort of the power of those more evenly distributed setups. We've seen a lot of success with battleship setups, but any meta where we're fielding 3 faction battleships, it's so critical. It's so critical that you win the early fight. And I think, again, this is a testament to putting power in the hands of as many people as possible, as much power as possible in the hands of as many pilots as possible. And allowing, the Brutix Navy issue pilots, the Vexor pilots, that's 6 people right there that are carrying around with them substantial amounts of DPS. That just doesn't exist on the Verge of Collapse team. There's 3 DPS ships, and one mistake on the Rote Kapelle team can be covered. One mistake by a DPS ship on Verge of Collapse, like that Fleet Typhoon that got tackled early, can be the end of a team. And in this case, I think that was certainly true in a large degree, but what do you think about their choice of faction battleships? I mean, how do you feel about pairing Fleet Typhoons, which are notorious for their long-range DPS, with something like a Vindicator, which is more favored in a rush brawly setup?
Given the fact that we didn't see much damage going down across the first 2 minutes of that fight when they weren't really, there weren't damps on the Fleet Foons early on, and the teams were only maybe 70 or 80 apart, you would expect the Fleet Foons to be able to lay down damage if they're cruise fit. So the only thing I can deduce from that is they decided to go Torp fit, and were just an all-in close-range setup that really didn't play to their strengths. I think for one thing, like you say, the Vindicator can only do so much, but to that same point, he needs to do that much, and he wasn't. If you watch the end of that match while we were talking there, once the Guardian goes down, there are 3 Brutix Navy issues right on top of that Vindicator. Not a single one of them's wept. One of them's even dying. He's in low armor, but it seems to me that they just kind of gave up toward the end of that match. But I really wonder. You didn't see a whole lot of multiple webbing going down from that Vindicator, so I question the fit. I wonder if the pilot wasn't, paying attention. He wasn't focused. I don't know. But really, if you're going to sink that many points into those battleships, like you say, you cannot make a mistake. You have to have a very solid plan, a very good idea of how you're going to execute that plan, and multiple contingencies for whatever you might face while trying to execute that plan. And you fail any one of those points, and it's because you're going to unravel. Versus, like you say, spreading eggs across multiple baskets in the Rote Kapelle setup, you had a lot of redundancy there. They lost a Vexor early. It didn't matter. The DPS didn't have a notable drop-off. I think even they lose one of those Brutix Navies, I don't think it still makes very much of a difference. Like you say, those Vexors put out an awful lot of damage. The Brutix Navies put out an awful lot of damage. So you've got 6 ships there that do fairly competent damage, and if it really comes down to a slugfest where ships are exploding on either side in that match at fairly even rate, you still have enough DPS from the Rote side after they lose the 3 Brutix Navy issues that you can still probably sink a battleship in that time. And assuming you've taken 2 out with the Brutix Navies, the match is still over, even with just Vexors left. So really, I feel like going into that, the setup, Verge of Collapse was hamstrung to a degree just based on their own setup. And they really didn't find any mistakes to capitalize on. And as a result, just yeah, they lost the match pretty convincingly.
Especially with the gamble from the Punisher. I mean, they sent the Punisher in, despite being 1 point up just based on the team comps. And I do think it's interesting that Verge of Collapse has the option to send in a Punisher. Rote Kapelle doesn't have that option. I mean, not only are their frigates worth more points, but they're higher DPS. So I think that was an interesting decision, and really Verge of Collapse did have an option that Rote Kapelle didn't, and sending an Inyo in would have been way more ballsy than sending that Punisher in. But what I was gonna say is for armor comps in general, you're typically looking at a battle of control. If you see two armor compositions facing each other, you're looking at a battle of control, be it range or newt pressure. I mean, all sorts of things. This was actually one of, I mean, that comes to mind anyways. It was one of the few matches that it was two armor comps based almost entirely on DPS. I mean, it was two high DPS armor comps. I found that really interesting, and I think, I don't know, it throws me off. The Brutix Navy issues made total sense. You see a lot of synergy in the setup of Rote Kapelle. Verge of Collapse, it throws me off. Like, they don't have particularly great control, even with the Vindicator. And they don't have exceedingly good DPS. They have okay DPS, but it's not as mobile and it's not as applicable as Rote Kapelle. So I think that was a really nice setup by Rote Kapelle.
I will say the one criticism I do have of that setup is being armor, being close range DPS. They face a kiting setup, a longer range setup, maybe a cruise missile based setup, which is what we kind of thought going into that match it was going to be from those fleet foons, or even a heavy missile kiting setup of some sort. Sleipnirs even, maybe they have a lot more trouble with it because Brutix navies have to be relatively close to get their DPS in, and if they can't run down their targets, they're just kind of at the mercy of their targets. So that concludes our coverage here of match 82 from day 3 of ATXI. If you're interested in hearing our comments on more matches, check them out on notiny.com.